Hello, everyone. I hope you are relaxed, comfortable, and ready for the coziest of stories to help you off to sleep. The stories in this wee series surround your favourite little sleepy Scottish cat, Morag, as well as many of her friends. And in this story, she catches up with her fellow Moggy Patch. But there is someone else they encounter along the way. Now, lie back. Take a nice deep breath and welcome back to the sleepy story world of Snooze with Sam and the adventures of Morag, the sleepy cat. The cat flap nearly flew clean off the hinges, such was the speed of wee Ginger Morag jettisoning herself from the house. It was just one of those days, you know, where the sun is shining so brightly and so warmly it has the power to simply gravitate the laziest souls out of their beds and into the outdoors, even in the early hours, and even for such a sleepy cat like Morag. The time was around 7:45 on a fresh April morning. Not a few weeks ago, the hills around Blackhill Farm were shrugging off the remnants of winter, with the odd snow shower rudely arriving uninvited amongst the sporadic warmer days of impending springtime. Now, however, it had arrived in full force. It was one of those mornings which is difficult to put into words, as though the world had changed gear overnight. The air was what you would call comfortably mild, even this early. The sun shone with a heat not felt for months up until this point. The atmosphere in the garden was tepid and fragrant with the scents of pollinating daffodils and honeysuckle. There was a buzz about the place, literally. Huge bumblebees swung clumsily between flowers, rubbing shoulders with hungry wasps and butterflies, all keen for a wholesome nectar breakfast. It was one of those mornings which fed the soul in a way that was indescribably fulfilling. and Morag couldn't wait to get started. Peering around, sniffing the air, Morag spotted, sitting on the dry stone wall at the bottom of the garden between two shrubs, her good friend Patch, otherwise known as the Pumpkin Cat. He was a handsome wee moggy, with dark, browny black patches on otherwise glossy white fur. They had encountered each other in the autumn time, when Morag had taken a little trip to an undiscovered part of the area and found him hiding in a pumpkin. Since then, they'd become very close and often played together, taking adventures whenever and wherever possible. And today, Patch was evidently up for an adventure too. Morag cantered over and up onto the wall, dodging the clucking and pottering chickens, excited to see her friend. Patch suggested they go exploring today, somewhere new and exciting. Morag agreed, and so they hopped off the wall and down into the field beneath the garden, setting off towards the steading at the far side. After a wee while of weaving in and out of the grass, they arrived at the building, and in front of them stood the most enormous barn doors. They'd never actually been in the barn before. It was normally so smelly and full of loud mooing noises. Besides, it was usually closed and locked. Today, however, it seemed fairly quiet, and there was an open crack in the doorway. Curiosity got the better of the pair of them, and so they slowly padded over to the open door and slid in that way that cats do. Well, one thing was for sure. It was still absolutely reeking in there. Neither Morag nor Patch could help but recoil from the assault on their delicate noses. After a moment or two, they got used to it and proceeded to have a good look around. It was quite dark, but at the far side there shone some bright sunlight from a few roof-mounted skylights, which shone dusty beams down to the floor below. The ground was concrete for the most part, with some broken wooden beams in places, presumably with dugouts or hollows below. It was covered in scattered straw trimmings and other not so pleasant deposits. Along either side of the barn, alloy gates separated enclosures from one another, but they all seemed empty and free of any beasts. This was definitely the home of those moo-moos, Morag thought, but they weren't in there today. Cautiously, Patch tiptoed across the floor, scanning left and right. He could sense something. His whiskers twitched. And then Morag could also sense something. They weren't alone. It was almost eerily quiet. Then they heard a small sound from the far corner of the barn. It was only a wee noise, barely a muffled grunt, but it was there nevertheless. Then it came again, but this time it was deeper. What was that, they thought? The two cats slowly and steadily slid across to the source of the sound and peered through the gate of the furthest enclosure. And to their surprise, they saw the most fascinating thing. Tucked away in the back was a great big Highland cow, though to the cats she looked just like a great ginger ball of wool, the type they would ordinarily bat about and play with at home. The cow was lying horizontally, clearly exhausted and sleepy, grunting softly. They almost didn't see it at first, but as their eyes adjusted to the gloom, Morag and Patch then realized that in front of the big mother cow was a miniature version. This small calf was sprawled across the hay, weak limbs flailing around in an attempt to right itself and stand. Morag asked the mother cow if she was okay, and through dozy eyes she nodded and reassured the cats that all was well. Patch then asked the cow if her wee one had a name yet, though they looked as fresh as the spring morning on which it was clearly born. Isla, the mother said. Isla was her name. This wee cowling was certainly determined to crack on with her life, despite only having been part of this world for a few minutes. Morag and Patch watched on as this wee thing wrestled with gravity, all wobbly knees and shuffling hooves. Isla let out teeny honks and bleats, still only getting to grips with every element of her form and function. The mother cow then said to the cats that she wished she was outside now with the rest of the cows, that she had been shut inside in preparation for Isla to arrive. It would be the best thing for the calf just now to see some sunlight and to move around, but they were stuck inside, cooped up in the enclosure. Morag and Patch looked at each other and came to the same idea. Up on the end of the enclosure gate, a small blue rope was looped around a post, keeping the gate closed. Patch, spotting this, primed himself for the leap, wiggling his bum, and sprang with precision up onto the post top. He reached down and pawed at the rope, and eventually he got a claw around a strand and limply lifted the rope clear of the gate post. Morag then nudged her face between the gate and post and prized the two clear of each other, opening the enclosure. Both mother and calf mooed with glee, and it was but a moment before wee Isla was stumbling in the direction of the gate. Very pleased with themselves, Morag and Patch led the way back to the barn door, with Isla not too far behind, still very wobbly and weak, and her mother close in tow. The cats slipped through the narrow gap with hardly a whisper, and then moments later the tiny battering ram in the shape of Isla fell right into the door with a thud, shifting the entire thing open another few feet. When the sunshine fell upon the little cow, it was a sight to behold. Isla cried with joy and did her best to run around in the grass. Everything was new and exciting and overwhelming to this wee cow, though she was clearly loving every moment. Her mother watched on from just outside the barn and revelled at the sight of her wee Isla dancing around with Morag and Patch. They were enjoying their new friend as much as anyone. It must have suddenly got a little too much for wee Isla, as, without any warning, she slowed down and could hardly stop herself from collapsing into a tuft of sun-soaked grass and resting her eyes almost instantly. In a mere moment, she was breathing heavily and fast asleep. Morag and Patch laughed and thought to keep an eye on her for a wee while, so they assured her mother and curled up together with Isla in the grass. The morning sunshine was so very warm now that even the cats couldn't help but feel sleepy either. With the sounds of the birds, the buzzing of bees, and the distant murmur of sheep and cows, Morag closed her eyes, dreaming of all the adventures that she and her friends could get up to. There was no limit to what they could do or where they could go. How exciting! She pondered all the possibilities, fancied over the details, and slept soundly in the anticipation of what they'd all get up to next.